The morning I turned 18, they gave me a cardboard box, a bus ticket, and 37 seconds of eye contact from a man whose name I never learned. That was it. 18 years inside the Hargrove Children's Home in rural Pennsylvania, and my exit ceremony was a cardboard box and a handshake from a stranger in a corridor that smelled of floor wax and institutional coffee, and the particular staleness of a building where the windows were never opened wide enough. My caseworker, Mrs. Delacroix, was at least familiar. She had managed my file for the last 4 years, a compact woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back too tightly and the practiced emotional neutrality of someone who had done this 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more. She sat across from me in her office, the one with the dying fern in the corner that nobody watered, and the motivational poster above her desk that read "Every day is a new beginning" in a font that had given up entirely on the concept. She slid a manila envelope across the desk. "Nora," she said, "this is everything." I opened it. Inside was my transitional stipend, $300, which felt like a fortune and would last approximately 2 weeks. My social security card, my birth certificate, and a folded letter on heavy cream paper with a letterhead I didn't recognize. Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law, Dunmore, Pennsylvania. "A lawyer's office contacted us 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Delacroix said, folding her hands on her desk with the precision of someone who has learned that folded hands signal composure. "Regarding your grandfather's estate." I looked up from the envelope. My grandfather. The words felt like something discovered in a sealed attic room. Dusty, unexpected, belonging to a life I had been told no longer existed. I had exactly 3 memories of him. The smell of pipe tobacco layered over machine oil, a voice like a radio left on in another room, low and constant and somehow reassuring. And his hands, large, scarred at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life and considered the scars a reasonable trade. He had disappeared from my life when I was 5 years old, the same year my mother died. The official record said he was unable to provide adequate care, that he had relinquished his guardianship voluntarily, that I was better served by the state. I had believed it for 13 years. I had built my entire understanding of myself around it. That I was a girl no one had chosen to keep, that whatever I had lacked, it was enough to make the people who should have loved me most decide that someone else, some institutional system of rotating strangers and beige walls, was preferable to staying. "His estate," I said carefully, "the way you say something when you're not sure if the floor beneath you is solid." Mrs. Delacroix's expression shifted slightly, a fraction of a degree barely perceptible, in a way I couldn't quite name. Not sympathy exactly, something more complicated, something that looked like a woman who knew more than she was permitted to say in her professional capacity. "There's a property," she said, "in a town called Millhaven, about 90 minutes from here by bus. The lawyers have been holding it in trust until your 18th birthday." She paused. They were very specific about the timing. "What kind of property?" She looked down at her paperwork and then back up at me. "That's where it gets unusual." The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on Millhaven's Main Street, wedged above a hardware store that smelled of sawdust and machine oil and the satisfying practicality of tools. The bus had dropped me at the corner 2 hours after I'd left Hargrove, my cardboard box riding the seat beside me like a companion, the letter from the lawyers folded in my jacket pocket where I could feel it against my ribs. The town was small, the kind of small where the gas station attendant and the woman at the post office know each other's children's names and middle names and the stories behind them. A place where a stranger carrying a cardboard box through the center of town at 11 in the morning is noted, categorized, and discussed before she reaches the end of the block. I was noted. I kept walking. The lawyer's name was Edmund Whitmore, and he was approximately 900 years old. He had white hair that had decided to do whatever it wanted, a dark suit that had been expensive in an era I hadn't been born into, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale and clear and carrying the accumulated weight of too many secrets kept too long, arranged in the particular way of a man who has made peace with what he knows. He stood when I entered and extended his hand across a desk covered in the organized archaeology of a working lawyer's life. "Miss Calloway," he said, "please, sit down." I sat. His office smelled of old paper and something else beneath that, something I couldn't name yet, something that reminded me of the inside of a metal cabinet left closed for decades, a smell with time embedded in it. He settled back into his chair and regarded me with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned that the things worth saying deserved the space to be said properly. "Your grandfather was a precise man," he began. "He left very specific instructions. The contents of this meeting were not to be shared with you a single day before your 18th birthday. He allowed himself a thin, private smile that suggested he had found the instruction professionally unusual but personally admirable. "You are aware that today is your 18th birthday?" "I'm aware." "Good." He opened a folder on his desk. "Your grandfather, Raymond Calloway, passed away 14 months ago. He left his entire estate, such as it is, to you as his sole surviving heir." He paused in the way of a man who has learned that pauses are load-bearing. "There are complications." "There always are," I said. He almost smiled again. "Your grandfather worked for the United States government from 1953 to 1971, specifically for a division of the Department of Civil Defense. You'll understand that in that era, civil defense meant something very particular. I had studied it in school. The duck and cover drills, the fallout shelters stocked with canned water and crackers, the persistent low hum of existential dread that had shaped an entire generation into people who smiled more than they meant to because the alternative was to acknowledge how fragile everything was. He was involved in the construction and management of emergency preparedness facilities," Whitmore continued. "What were commonly called fallout shelters, though the ones your grandfather worked with were considerably more sophisticated than that term implies." He set down the folder and folded his hands. "In 1961, he was stationed in Millhaven as part of a classified infrastructure project. A federal facility was constructed here, underground, self-contained, designed to house and protect essential government personnel and records in the event of a nuclear exchange." He let the silence settle for a moment. "In 1962, the project was defunded. The facility was sealed. The surrounding property, approximately 40 acres of Pennsylvania woodland, was transferred quietly to private ownership as part of the program's dissolution. Your grandfather was the man who sealed it." Another pause. "He was also the man who purchased the land." I felt something shift in my chest. The way the ground shifts before an earthquake. A deep structural rearrangement of everything you assumed was solid. "He bought it," I said. "He did, with his own money, at considerable personal sacrifice. From what I have been able to piece together over the years of managing this estate." Whitmore opened the desk drawer and placed 3 objects on the desk between us with the deliberateness of a man who understands that objects can carry more weight than words. The first was a large iron key. Old and heavy, dark with age, its head ornate and its teeth complex. The kind of key that looked like it belonged to something that mattered, something built to last. The second was a hand-drawn map. The paper was old but carefully preserved. Laminated, I realized, sometime decades ago, by a man who understood that paper does not keep forever but intentions should. The map showed a section of woodland, meticulously detailed, with elevation markings, compass bearings, distances noted in a small and careful hand. At the center, marked with a precise X, main access, shaft 1. The third was an envelope. My name was written on the front in the same small, careful handwriting. Just Nora, not Miss Calloway, not to whom it may concern. Just my name, the way you write the name of someone you have been meaning to speak to for a very long time. "The key and the map are self-explanatory," Whitmore said. "The letter is from your grandfather. He wrote it 12 years ago when he first drafted his estate documents. He updated it twice after that." He met my eyes directly, the gaze of a man delivering something he has been entrusted with and takes that trust seriously. He knew he would not be alive to explain this to you himself. He wanted to leave you something better than silence. I looked at the 3 objects on the desk between us. Why did he give me up? The question came out before I chose it, the way the truest questions always do. If he owned property, if he had resources, why did he let the state take me? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Outside his window, a delivery truck idled on Millhaven's Main Street, and someone somewhere in the building was making coffee, and the world continued its ordinary business while I sat in an old lawyer's office and waited for the answer to the question I had been carrying for 13 years. I cannot speak to all of it, he said carefully, but I can tell you that the letter addresses that question directly. He stood, slowly, the movement of a man who has been sitting for too many decades. I'll give you a few minutes alone. He left, pulling the door softly closed behind him. I sat in the quiet. Pale spring light fell through old glass, casting irregular rectangles on the worn wooden floor. I could hear the clock on his shelf marking seconds, each one distinct and unhurried. I picked up the envelope. The paper inside was heavy and cream-colored. The tape had been resealed more than once. He had opened it, revised it, resealed it with the particular care of a man returning to something he needed to get exactly right. I pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and read, "My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, then you have made it. You have turned 18. You have found your way to Edmund's office. You have been handed a key that has not been turned in over 60 years, and you are probably terrified and furious and wondering why on earth I am doing this to you. Let me start with the most important thing. I did not abandon you. I know you believe that. I know what the records say. I know what Mrs. Delacroix and every caseworker before her told you about your grandfather, that he couldn't cope, that he gave up, that you were not enough reason for him to stay. All of it was a lie. A lie I told them, a lie I told myself I could live with for your sake because the alternative was something I could not risk. I need you to know that before you read another word. You were always the reason. You were the only reason any of it mattered." I stopped reading. I placed the letter face down on the desk and sat with my hands flat on my knees and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe when something is happening to you that is too large to take in all at once and you need to give your body something simple to do while your mind catches up. Outside the window, the delivery truck pulled away. Somewhere in the building, someone poured coffee. The clock kept marking seconds. When I could breathe normally again, I picked up the letter and kept reading. The map led me 3 miles outside of town, down a gravel road that narrowed gradually, losing confidence in itself until it was barely a path, into a stand of old-growth timber that swallowed the afternoon light and replaced it with something older and quieter and green. I had a flashlight from the hardware store downstairs. I had the map. I had the key in my jacket pocket, solid and cold against my ribs, and I had the letter, all 6 pages of it, folded carefully and pressed against my heart like a second heartbeat keeping time with my own. The woods were dense and very quiet in the particular way that old forests are quiet, not empty but settled, full of small sounds that belong there. Birch and pine and old oak, their roots lifting the ground into low ridges and shallow valleys. Moss covered everything. The rocks, the fallen logs, the bases of the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin and something underneath those things. Something mineral, something cold, something that had to do with deep ground and what deep ground keeps. I followed the map's bearings. The handwriting was precise and the landmarks were still there. All of them, 60 years on. A specific granite outcropping shaped like a seated figure. A creek crossing where the stones had been arranged for easier passage, a stand of white birch that my grandfather had marked with a small etched arrow low on the bark, low enough that the tree had grown around it now, absorbed it, made it permanent. He had kept this path findable, not just once, at the moment of sealing, but across decades, coming back, year after year, clearing the undergrowth, maintaining the bearings, keeping the landmarks readable. He had tended this path the way you tend something you intend for someone specific. The way you maintain a promise, for me. He had been coming here all those years for me. The entrance was not what I expected. There was no hatch in the ground, no warning sign, no obvious government infrastructure. Instead, the hillside rose gently ahead of me, and at its base, half buried in decades of accumulated pine needles and fallen leaves and creeping moss, was a concrete apron 6 feet wide, barely visible unless you were looking for exactly it. In its center was a steel door, painted green once, 60 years ago, the paint mostly surrendered now to rust and weather and time. In the center of the door was a keyhole, old, large, deliberate, built for the key in my pocket. I stood there for a long time. The woods were quiet around me. A crow called somewhere up in the canopy, the sound traveling through the trees and then absorbed by them. Wind moved through the highest branches, a sound like breathing, like something enormous sleeping lightly. My grandfather had sealed this door in 1962, had stood on this same concrete, turned a key, and walked away carrying whatever it cost him to do that. He had been, as far as anyone knew, the last person to stand where I was standing, 63 years. I took the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock as though it had never left, as though the lock had been waiting, patient and unhurried, for exactly this. I had expected resistance, rust, mechanical failure, the seized protest of something dormant too long. Instead, I felt the mechanism engage with a solidity that said clearly this had been maintained, oiled, attended to, the lock of a man who had never stopped tending to something he trusted someone would eventually open. I turned the key, the bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath finally, carefully, released. I put both hands on the handle and pulled. The door swung outward on hinges that barely complained, just a low groan, almost polite. And cold air rolled out of the darkness beyond, dry, completely preserved, carrying a smell I had never encountered before and have never fully forgotten since. Metal and old concrete and paper and time, the smell of a room that had been sealed before my mother was born. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped through. The entry shaft was a concrete corridor, 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, sloping downward at a shallow but deliberate angle. Emergency lighting fixtures lined the walls, dead now, their bulbs gone dark decades ago, and heavy conduit ran along the ceiling. Insulated wire snaking to junction boxes painted the particular shade of institutional green that must have been government standard in 1961. There were numbers stenciled at intervals on the walls, white on green. Distances, designations, the administrative language of a facility built for a catastrophe that never came. I counted my steps as I descended. By the time the slope leveled off, I had taken 47, somewhere between 30 and 40 feet underground. The corridor opened into a room. No, not a room, a complex, a world. I swept my flashlight beam across the space and felt my breath leave me in a long, involuntary exhale. It was vast. The ceiling was 12 feet high, reinforced concrete ribbed with steel, and it stretched ahead and to both sides in a series of connected chambers, metal shelving units, heavy industrial, the kind built to hold weight without apology, lined every wall, bolted into concrete with the permanence of things meant to survive what the surface could not. Equipment panels covered the walls between the shelves, dials and switches and gauges, all dormant, all frozen at the moment of closure in 1962. A communications room with a radio array that belonged in a museum, a generator room with 2 massive diesel units that squatted in the darkness like sleeping animals, waiting. A medical station with supplies still sealed in wax paper, a dormitory with 12 bunks still made with military precision, their wool blankets laid flat and unslept in for 6 decades, still waiting for the emergency personnel who never came. This was a world built for a catastrophe that was prepared for and then never arrived, preserved perfectly against the disaster that didn't happen. But that wasn't what stopped me. In the center of the main chamber, on a steel work table bolted to the floor, sat a second box. Not a government box, not a steel case or an archival container or anything that belonged to the official inventory of this place. A wooden crate, handmade, the joints dovetailed with the care of someone who worked with wood as a form of prayer. My grandfather's hands had made this. I could feel it in some part of me that precedes language, the same way I had felt the maintained lock, the tended path, the oiled hinges. This was built for me. Everything in this room had been waiting for a long time, but this box had been built specifically for the moment when I arrived. My name was on the lid. Not a formal designation. Not Nora Calloway, heir, or any bureaucratic construction. Just Nora, in familiar handwriting, the way you write the name of someone you have been meaning to speak to for most of your life. I opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin to protect against decades of moisture, a leather journal. Beneath that, a cassette recorder from the 1980s, the handheld kind that journalists used, with a row of small label tapes in a foam insert, each one dated in the same careful handwriting. Beneath that, a sealed packet of documents, thick and official weighted, and at the very bottom, wrapped separately in a piece of flannel that had once been a shirt, I could tell by the button still attached to one edge, a bundle of envelopes tied with a piece of twine that had faded from white to cream with age. I picked up the top envelope. It was addressed, in my grandfather's handwriting, to the Hargrove Children's Home in rural Pennsylvania. Aten, Nora Calloway. The envelope was sealed, unopened. The stamp in the corner was old, the postmark faded but legible. He had mailed this. Someone had received it and returned it. I went through the bundle carefully, counting. 162 envelopes, all addressed to me, all sealed, all returned. 162 months of letters, written to a granddaughter who never received a single one. 13.5 years of reaching out through a system that sent every attempt back unmarked. And he had kept writing anyway, every month. One letter, addressed to me, sent into a silence that sent it back and kept anyway. Accumulated here, waiting. I sat down on the concrete floor, the cold of it immediate through my jeans, and I held the bundle in my lap, and I did not cry yet, because I was not yet finished understanding what I was holding. I read the journal first. My grandfather had started it the day after he sealed this facility. The first entry was dated October 1962. The same weeks that the Cuban Missile Crisis had held the entire world suspended over an abyss it could not look away from. I have sealed Shaft 1, he wrote. The project is over. Washington has pulled the funding. The new doctrine is mobility and dispersal. They say fixed shelters are strategically obsolete. Maybe they're right. But I keep thinking about what we built here. We built it for people, for the possibility of saving lives if the very worst arrived, and now we are simply closing the door and walking away as though it never existed. I cannot do that. I have purchased the land. 43 acres of Pennsylvania woodland with this facility beneath it. The government doesn't want it formally acknowledged. They barely want it to exist in the record. That's fine. It belongs to me now. Someday it will belong to my daughter's daughter. Someday it will be Nora's. She'll know what to do with it. I have to believe that. He had written those words before I was born. He had purchased this land and written my name and made a decision about me before I existed, the way you make a decision about someone you already know you will love. I moved to the cassette recorder next. There was a note taped to it in fresher ink, added later than the rest. Your hearing may be better than your reading on certain days, or perhaps I simply needed to hear my own voice saying these things out loud, to be certain I had actually said them. The tapes explain what the journal couldn't hold. Begin with the one marked "Begin Here." I loaded the tape, checked the batteries, pressed play, static, then silence, then a voice. Deep, slightly roughened by age and by use, a voice that had years behind it and didn't try to hide them, and I knew it, not with my conscious mind, not with the part of me that reasoned and remembered deliberately, but with some older and more fundamental part, the part that knows things before it knows how it knows them. Nora, the voice said, and my chest contracted as though the word had weight. If you're listening to this, you found the key. You found the map. You came. I'm not surprised. You were always going to come. I knew that about you even when you were 4 years old. You had that particular kind of stubbornness that looks from the outside like pure foolishness and feels from the inside like the only thing that makes any sense. A pause, the sound of a chair, a long exhale. I need to tell you about 1962, not the history. You'll know the history. I need to tell you what happened in this facility, in this town, in the weeks before I sealed that door. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is also the answer to the question you have been carrying your whole life. The question of why. He talked for 40 minutes on that first tape. His voice was measured and steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this, who understood the shape of what he needed to say and had arranged it carefully so I could follow it, who had thought about this conversation for years and had no intention of wasting it now. He talked about the facility, about Continuity Station 7, the project's classified designation, about the 18 months of construction, the rotating crews working in shifts, the materials delivered at night to avoid documentation, about what it felt like to spend 1.5 years building a room designed to house human beings through the end of the surface world, the particular quality of thought that work produced, the way it changed what you noticed when you came back above ground. And then he talked about the day of the decommissioning and what he had found. The team from Washington came in October, he said. 3 men in suits that weren't built for field work. They had a checklist and they were thorough. You had to credit them for that. They went through every room, cataloged every piece of equipment, confirmed the sealing of every access point, and then they signed the paperwork and drove away. What they did not know, what I only discovered because I came back the following week, alone, to say a proper goodbye to something I had spent 2 years of my life building, was that they had left something behind, not by accident. He described a room off the communications corridor, small, unmarked on the official floor plans, its existence attributed during construction to secondary storage. The door had always been locked during the project's operation. He had never seen what went inside. When he returned that October, the door was open. The filing cabinets inside were military standard, locked. But I had a master key, the kind they issued to senior staff and didn't always collect back at decommissioning. I opened them. His voice changed on the recording. Just slightly. The steadiness held, but underneath it was something that had never fully resolved. A controlled disturbance, the sound of a man who had lived for decades with something that did not settle. The files were records of a domestic surveillance program, names, addresses, recorded conversations, transcribed telephone calls, informant reports, hundreds of names. People who had been watched by their own government, not suspected of crimes, not under formal investigation, simply watched, cataloged, filed. Politicians, journalists, civil rights organizers, labor organizers, ordinary people who had attended a meeting once or signed a petition or written a letter to their congressman that someone had decided was worth noting. And some of those names, Nora, I recognized them. People from this town, from neighboring towns. People I had worked beside, eaten lunch with, shaken hands with, people who had not done anything except exist in ways that someone with power had decided warranted monitoring. I understood immediately why the files had been left here. If this facility was ever officially rediscovered, they would be assumed to be routine Cold War-era records, unremarkable, administrative, the ordinary debris of a classified program. But if someone knew what they were looking at, if someone took them and understood their meaning, they were evidence of a program that certain people, certain families had built and run and profited from and then buried, evidence those families would go to considerable lengths to keep underground. I took the files, every one of them. I moved them to a room I sealed myself, behind the dormitory wall panel. You'll find it, the third panel from the left, the same key opens it. And then I went to find someone I trusted. That was my first mistake. I trusted the wrong person. The second tape, the third, his voice staying steady while the story it carried grew heavier. The senior colleague he had trusted, a man with a decade of shared work between them, a man my grandfather had believed to be built of the same materials as himself, had made a telephone call. Within days, my grandfather found himself sitting across a desk from men who were not angry, which was worse than anger, who were calm and measured and very clear about what they expected him to sign. He refused. Things moved quickly after that. He was followed. His phone line clicked. A window was broken in a way that left no evidence of forced entry. Small, unmistakable communications from people who wanted him to understand what they were capable of without ever giving him anything he could take to authorities. And then your mother died, he said on the third tape. And then there was you. This 4-year-old girl with her whole life arranged in front of her like an open road. And I looked at the men who had been following me, who had broken my window and clicked my phone line, and I understood something very clearly. They would use you. If they needed to, they would use you against me without hesitation or remorse, because that is what people like that do. They find what you cannot afford to lose, and they hold it where you can see it. I could not let that happen. I could not protect you and fight them openly at the same time. I had to choose. The choice had cost him everything he had. He had staged a breakdown carefully. Genuine enough in some ways because the grief was real and the fear was real, and the weight of what he was carrying was the weight of a man doing the hardest thing he had ever done. He had told the system he couldn't cope. He had signed the papers that put me in the state's care. He had performed the role of a broken old man with such conviction that everyone believed it, because the truth was too strange to be believed. And lies that are simple and sad are always easier to accept than truths that are complicated and terrible. And then he had gone quiet, had retreated from the world, and had spent 40 years in deliberate, patient, meticulous silence, building a case. I knew I could not fight them as myself, he said, a grieving old man with a classified background and a story about secret surveillance files. They had lawyers who would have made me disappear into irrelevance before the first sentence was finished. I needed evidence so thorough, so cross-referenced, so legally airtight that there was no air in it to breathe discrediting arguments into. It took 40 years. I am sorry it took that long. I am sorry for every month of those 40 years that you spent not knowing why. He described what he had assembled. Not just the original files, those alone would not have been enough, he said. A single cache of old documents could be attributed to many things. He had spent decades finding corroboration, former program employees who had carried guilt for too long and finally needed to set it down, records technicians who had made copies of things they were ordered to destroy and kept those copies in shoeboxes under beds for years, and eventually found someone they trusted enough to hand them over, a federal judge, now retired, whose name appeared in the files, not as a target but as a participant, who had decided that honesty at the end was worth more than the comfort of silence maintained all the way through, and through all of it. The family at the center, the family that had built the original program and then spent 6 decades converting that machinery into legitimate power. Political careers, business empires, the kind of respectability that accumulates when there is enough money and enough time and no one alive who remembers the original transaction. His name is Martin Voss, my grandfather said on the 4th tape, his voice carrying something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but lived in the territory between them. He is currently a United States Senator. His father ran the program in its later years. His grandfather authorized its original expansion. 3 generations of a family that built its fortune on the surveillance and intimidation of American citizens, and then spent 60 years becoming the kind of people who get their photographs on the covers of magazines. Everything I have gathered is in this room, in this bunker, waiting for you. The final tape ended with static. I sat in the silence of a room sealed before I was born. surrounded by 60 years of patient, meticulous, expensive love arranged as evidence, and I held my grandfather's voice in my mind the way you hold something carefully when you know you can only hold it for a moment before it changes into something else. I was 18 years old. I had $300 and a cardboard box and a bus ticket back to a city where I knew no one and had no place to go. And I was sitting at the center of a story that had started decades before I existed, in a room that had been waiting for me specifically, built by a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure I would have a choice that he had never been given. I stood up. I walked to the dormitory. I found the third wall panel from the left, and I pressed the mechanism and it opened exactly as he had said it would, smoothly, maintained, revealing the room behind it. On the left, 32 archival boxes, neatly labeled and dated, the 40-year accumulation of a man who had turned his grief into something that could not be ignored. On the right, a steel case. No label, just weight. I opened the steel case and looked at what was inside for a long time. Then I closed it and left it exactly where it was. I picked up the first archival box and the second and the third, stacking them carefully. Then I went back for the wooden crate with the cassette recorder and the letters, all 162 of them, and I carried everything to the corridor and then up the slope, 47 steps, toward the rectangle of afternoon light at the top. I stepped out into the Pennsylvania woods, into air that smelled of pine and wet earth and the particular clarity of a spring afternoon. The steel door swung closed behind me. I turned the key and heard the bolt engage. Then I picked up the boxes and started walking toward the road. The federal prosecutor's name was Judith Harlan. She had spent 20 years in the Philadelphia field office watching justice move the way glaciers move, slowly, with immense force, reshaping the landscape over time in ways that were invisible until suddenly they weren't. When I walked into her office on a Thursday morning in May carrying an archival box and my grandfather's letter, she looked at me for a long moment over her reading glasses, the look of a woman recalibrating. "Sit down," she said. I sat. "Tell me everything." So I did. She spent 3 days with the files before she said anything substantive. Then she called in 2 colleagues, and they spent 3 more days. Then she placed a call to the retired FBI director whose name my grandfather had included in his list, a man named Augustus Reeves who had spent the last decade of his career running quietly into the same wall my grandfather had been pushing against for 40 years, and who had, my grandfather wrote, been waiting for evidence exactly like this. "The documentation is extraordinary," Harlan told me at the end of the second week. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has seen enough to calibrate her own reactions precisely. And what I heard in it was not enthusiasm. She was too professional for enthusiasm, but something rarer. Conviction. "Your grandfather understood evidentiary standards at a level most attorneys don't achieve in their careers. He built this the way you build something you expect to last. He had 40 years, I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "he did. It took 11 months. There were depositions and hearings and days of testimony, and there was an army of lawyers deployed by the Voss family that arrived in waves, each wave more expensive and more aggressive than the last. There were moments when the whole architecture of the case seemed to tremble. A key witness who recanted under pressure, documents challenged on chain of custody grounds, a judge who recused himself under circumstances that were never fully explained. There were nights when I sat in the small apartment Harlan had helped me secure through a victims advocacy grant, because I refused, absolutely refused, to touch the money in the steel case in the bunker. And I read my grandfather's letters, all 162 of them. I read them in order, one at a time, slowly, giving each one the time it deserved. "I hope you are warm," he wrote when I would have been 9. "I hope there is someone in that place who is kind to you. I hope you have found at least one friend who makes you laugh." I had not, that year. I had spent that year in the 4th of my 6 placements, in a house where the rules were enforced with the consistency of someone who needed control the way other people need oxygen. I had not been warm enough, often enough. I had not had a friend who made me laugh. But reading those words now, in a small apartment in Philadelphia in the autumn of my 18th year, I understood that I had not been unthought of. I had not been invisible. Every month, in a farmhouse in Millhaven or in the woods beside a sealed bunker or at a desk somewhere in Pennsylvania, a man had sat down and written to me, knowing the letter would probably not arrive, writing it anyway. 162 months of that. 13.5 years. Some forms of love are too large for their circumstances. They have to go somewhere, even when there is nowhere for them to go. And so they keep being sent and kept when they come back, and sent again. The journalist my grandfather had named in his list, Caro Beale, who wrote for a national publication and had been trying to build this exact story for 3 years without the evidence to publish it, became something close to a friend over those 11 months. She was precise and relentless and occasionally frightening in her commitment, and she had spent enough time living alongside a story that she couldn't yet tell that the moment she could tell it, the telling was immaculate. Her piece ran on a Tuesday in February. 14,000 words, 6 pages, photographs of original documents that no one outside a small sealed room had seen in 60 years. By Friday, 2 of Martin Voss's senior aides had resigned without explanation. By the following Tuesday, a Senate subcommittee had opened a formal inquiry. By spring, he had announced he would not seek re-election. The settlements, civil and criminal, layered across multiple proceedings, took 2 more years to fully resolve. There was no single dramatic moment, no gavel coming down and righteousness arriving in one clean instant. Justice rarely works that way. What it looked like, from the inside, was a long series of smaller acknowledgments. The program formally recognized, affected families formally notified. Records opened that had been sealed since before most of them were born. A truth commission established with actual authority and actual funding. Former participants, some of them very old, finally able to set down things they had been carrying for decades. The Calloway family, which was me, which was only me, was formally recognized as the party responsible for preserving and presenting the evidence that made all of it possible. There was money involved. There is always money, eventually, in these things. Enough that the steel case in the bunker's right compartment became beside the point. I had it transferred to an educational fund for children aging out of the Pennsylvania foster care system, because my grandfather had spent his entire adult life trying to protect a child in exactly that position, and it seemed like the most honest place for it to end up. I am standing on the porch of a house in Millhaven. It is October. The trees have turned gold in the way they turn gold in Pennsylvania. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the whole forest decided together overnight. The air smells of wood smoke and the sweetness of fallen leaves and the particular quality of autumn air in a place where the seasons still mean something. Somewhere behind the house, 3 miles into the woodland and 40 feet underground, a Cold War bunker sits empty now. Its evidence removed, its purpose fulfilled, its story finally told completely. The door is still there. The key is on a hook inside the front door of my house. I haven't decided what to do with the space yet. I am in no hurry to decide. The house needed work when I inherited it. It still needs work. Houses that have been waiting for someone to come home always do. But my grandfather built the bones of it with the same care he brought to everything else. And the bones are good. And I am learning, slowly, with more mistakes than successes, in the company of people who have decided to show up and help, how to make the rest of it right. Judith Harlan came for dinner last month, with Caro Beale and Augustus Reeves, and we sat at my kitchen table until well past midnight, talking about what had happened and what might still happen, and whether any amount of formal accountability is ever actually enough. We decided it is not enough, but that enough is not the right standard. The right standard is whether it is better than the alternative, whether something has been changed that needed changing, whether the story that was sealed is now open to the air. We decided it was. We decided that was worth marking. I am studying environmental law 40 miles from here. I drive there 3 days a week in a truck that was in my grandfather's barn when I arrived, covered in canvas, maintained against the possibility that someone would eventually need it. Of course it was maintained. He maintained everything. On the passenger seat, I keep the bundle of letters, all 162 of them, retied with the same faded twine. I have read each one so many times the paper has gone soft at the creases. I am still reading them, still finding things in them I hadn't noticed before. Small observations, careful jokes, the 100 quiet ways a person who loves you reveals that love when they have no other outlet for it. I saw a hawk today that reminded me of the way you used to watch things when you were very small, he wrote when I would have been 15. Completely still, completely attentive, like you understood that some things only reveal themselves to people who are patient enough to wait. I don't remember being that way. But I believe him. He was watching. He was always watching. I have thought a great deal in these months about what it means that the letters were never delivered, about the institutional systems, the rules, the policies, the well-intentioned structures that looked at an envelope addressed to a child and returned it unopened because the protocol said to, about what gets lost in the space between what a system is designed to do and what it actually does, about how many children are in how many rooms right now, not knowing that someone somewhere is writing to them. I have decided not to let that knowledge become only grief. My grandfather didn't. He turned it into something actionable. He took the years that were taken from him and converted them into work that outlasted him, into files that sat sealed in the dark for decades and then changed things when the light finally reached them. That is the inheritance, not the land, not the settlement, not the vindication, as satisfying as vindication is. The inheritance is the understanding that the time you spend doing something right, carefully, patiently, without recognition, in the reasonable expectation that you will not live to see it completed, that time is not lost. It accumulates. It waits in the dark with the same fidelity as a sealed door on maintained hinges, waiting for someone to come and turn the key. He spent 60 years building something for me. He planted trees on this property that he knew he would never see fully grown. He planted them anyway because he understood something I am still learning. That the most important things you do are the things you do for someone whose face you may never see, in a future you may not live to witness, trusting that the work itself is enough reason to keep working. The gold trees are brilliant in the October light. I can see them from this porch, stretching toward the ridgeline above the property, tall and unbothered and entirely themselves. He planted them. I am learning to tend them, and someday, if I do this right, if I am careful and patient and faithful to what he left me, someone who does not yet exist will stand on this porch and look at trees that are older than they are, and know, without needing to be told, that someone loved them before they arrived. That is what it means to leave a key. Not to unlock a door, to unlock a future.